nature or attributes of God. This is a long one, so please write short, please write quickly. Any questions or problems, do ask. Top first box then. We start with this idea of God as eternal. This is the attribute of eternal. This is what you could get asked in your exam. So the question would ask you about the word eternal, and there's two views on eternal. Eternal as timeless and eternal as everlasting. And so eternal as timeless. God exists outside of time with no beginning and no end. The biblical passages that hint also at God's eternity, who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. So it is biblically sourced. This is found in Isaiah. So what you have to remember with eternal as timeless is, where is God? Omniscience is what does God see? So there's a very subtle difference between the two. So eternal is where actually is God, and God is outside of time. Nicholas Walter Storff points out that a timeless God is not just from the influence of classical philosophy. When you did one of your key knowledge test questions ages ago, it said, where is this influence of eternal come from? And most of you put the Bible. No. Classical philosophy like Plato's world of forms, form of the good, also are eternal. But it's not just that. So Walter Storff is arguing that it's not just the influence of classical philosophy, it's also because God had to be different from our human experience. God had to be separate from us. We as humans live a linear existence. We as humans live an existence that has past, present and future, whereas God does not. And then we have one of the first brilliant one-liners from Walter Storff, the gnawing of time bites all. Brilliant one-liner. Basically, we are gnawed away by time. Time slowly chips away at us. In an introduction, if you get a question on eternal, you need to establish the two views. Eternal as timeless from Boethius, eternal as everlasting from Swinburne. This first side does eternal, then we'll do omnipotence, we then do omniscience. So on that note, let's bring in Boethius. Boethius goes in the box underneath. In Book 5 of the Consolation of Philosophy, Book 5 meaning Chapter 5 of the Consolation of Philosophy, why is his book called that? He's being consoled, comforted by philosophy. Philosophy is Lady Philosophy, so he's being consoled in his jail cell because he's about to be executed. And so what does he do in his jail cell? He talks to his imaginary friend, Lady Philosophy. And what he talks about and thinks about is this idea that God does not experience past, present or future, but all time is present to God at the same time. So it's like time is all together. It's not that's past, that's present, that's future. All time is together. God does not exist in time, and eternity for Boethius is the whole, simultaneous and perfect possession of unending life. I really recommend you learn some quotes. Why? Because the quotes actually help you with your wording. So, for Boethius, eternity, time, existence for God is the whole. Think of it like a circle as being a whole, simultaneous is at the same time, and perfect possession. So God has perfect possession of unending life, no beginning and no end, and this is the whole time seen all together at the same time. All time is present to God simultaneously. In a bit in the apostrophes is because that's a quote. Like watching a film and seeing the opening titles and credits in one glance. So like on a DVD, you can see the whole of the DVD and you can pick which scene you want. That's just like that. You see the beginning and the end all in one glance on the screen. Obviously, that's an example that I've given to help you back it up. Clearly not Boethius, he didn't have films. Always explain your examples, give plenty of examples to help you with this one. You have to treat your examiner as if they do not know anything. Often what students do in this question, this exam, is they put loads and loads of words in one sentence and it just doesn't work. Make sure that you separate the different words, you explain each part of it, and then of course you evaluate it. The two boxes underneath where we're going is for the two supporters of Boethius. We keep the oldies together, Augustine and Aquinas. So always remember, your oldies stick together and your newbies stick together. So Swinburne, Walterstock, they're your newbies. And so the two boxes underneath, one is for Augustine, the other is for Aquinas. So you've got two separate nice boxes, one for each of them. So Augustine goes in one box, Aquinas goes in the other box. What Augustine says is that if God made the world at a particular point in time, well, what was God doing before that then? So what Augustine is arguing is God can never have been in time. Because if God makes everything, like God made the 7 days and creation, all of that, and he was in time to do that, then what was God doing before that? So it doesn't make sense. Also, the Bible indicates a timeless God who chose to create day and night, who is separate from this. There is no before for God, as time as we know it does not work in the same way for God. So time as we know it as linear. Past, present and future as a line. God knows it as a whole. So it's a circle versus a line. Aquinas, on the other hand, in the separate box, of course, talks about analogical language. You can bring in a little bit of religious language here if you wish, if you want to be really nice and fancy. So when we speak of God, we are using analogical language, analogy. God is not like us. We have no words to describe how God experiences time. So everything we say is just comparing similar things, but it's not the reality for God. If you want to bring a little bit of analogy of proportion in, that we can only relate our existence in proportion to, but God is the cause of our time, and so we can link God to it, but it's not the same for God. Fabulous. So if you want to go down any of the analogy route, you're welcome to. Aquinas also says that eternity exists as a simultaneous whole and time does not. Always, when you're revising this at home, always change the words into words that make more sense to you. So whenever I see the word whole, I think of a circle. Whenever I see time, I think of a line. And that's why God's existence is different to ours. Eternity for God is the whole. Eternity or time for us is a line. Past to present to future. We don't go back, we can't go forward. It's always just in a linear line. Where we're going to go in a second is to Anselm. Anselm has the two boxes underneath. Now, Anselm has been added. This topic used to be on the old spec. Anselm has now been added to this. So let's start working our way through Anselm. Anselm's four-dimensionalist approach. We thought the ontological argument was hard enough. This goes in the first of your two boxes. When dealing with Anselm's views, there are two main perspectives on time. There's the view of presentism versus the four dimensions. The four dimensions being height, width, depth and time. You do not need to know them as far as explain them. What would be really impressive if you do bring an Anselm into a question in your exam is to say what the four dimensions are. Obviously, time is the one that we're focusing on for this topic. So they're just there, height, width, depth and time. Presentism is exactly as it sounds on the tin. It's about living in the present. So only focus on the present moment. Past is gone, future has not yet happened. Reality is this moment. However, Anselm's view is quite different. Terms such as yesterday, last week, a year ago are subjective to the person perceiving that moment. Furthermore, I might say that a student is next to me, whereas, so Izzy is next to me, for example, but she sat across the room from Josh. And so it depends where you are in space. Space is meaning your location. So it's not just time that things differ for, but it's also where you are. So, for example, it's daytime now for us. In Australia, it might be yesterday still, or it might be night, or, depends where you are on the planet as to what you are experiencing. So it isn't just these terms yesterday, last week, a year ago. It's this idea that the whole concept of these are subjective. Time is subjective. So time and space means that your understanding is subjective, not just different from God, but different from each other. God is not limited by space and time like we are. Therefore, God can be in the past, present, and future at once. Of course, God is not limited by these, because if God was limited by these, then it means that there's something more powerful than God, and that's time. So God cannot be limited by time. At this stage, let me be clear. Anselm is also presenting a timeless view of God. He disagrees with Boethius. So you can use Anselm against Boethius if you wish. So Anselm and Boethius are different. Both are talking about timeless meaning not in time, separate from time, but they are presenting different views. The next slide will help you see what the differences really are. If you get a question specifically on Anselm in your exam, I don't think they'll be that mean. I wouldn't do it. I think one specifically on Anselm is quite tricky. However, if you get a question on any of the elements like eternal, bring this in passing. Brilliant. I think most questions on nature of God are hard anyway. I don't think they're going to be deliberately even more difficult by asking you something so specific like Anselm, especially because this is the new element. But because it's the new element, they might do. So we have to be prepared either way. So, box to the side, Anselm continued. God is not just in every time and space, but every time and space is in God. God is not contained by them, but in control of them. Now that bullet point is very, very important. What it means is this. Normally when we speak of God, we talk about God as being immanent, which means God is everywhere. God is here, he's there, he's everywhere. He's in all space and time at the same time. What Anselm is arguing is, no, God is not in all places at the same time. All places are in God at the same time. And so it's not that God is in all time and space, but actually time and space are part of God. God is not contained by them. God isn't contained by time. Time is contained within God. Now, the only way that I can think of it, and it's the only way I can explain it, is this idea, and I remember drawing some funny pictures on the board before. When God, for Boethius, sees time, God is separate. He sees all time in one glance. Anselm, it's like God being pregnant, and the baby is time and space. It is not separate from God. It is contained within God. So God is everywhere because it's part of God. It's the only way I can think of it as to what Anselm is saying there. This means that we do still have free will. God sees the free choices we made in the past and what we will do in the future. A bit like Aquinas is God on the hill. Sees the past, sees the future, but we're still free to do what we want on the path. So a very similar view. However, you still might criticise that and say, but even if God sees the free choices, he still sees them before us. Therefore, is it still really free? So you can criticise that if you wish. Boethius describes God's view of our free actions as though from a lofty peak mountain. So he says it's as though God is, so he's giving again a bit of an analogy, he's giving a bit of a comparison. It's as though God is on a lofty peak. What Anselm then argues is, no, there is no although about it. It's not as though this, it's actual literal fact. It's not as though God is doing anything. It is actually what God is doing. Literally, past, present and future is part of God. It's part of God's timelessness. It's not a comparison. It's not saying it's like God is on a lofty peak. No, this is actually as it is. This is the literal truth, that present and our futures are part of God's timelessness. Therefore, judgment and consequent reward and punishment are just. We make our free decisions, we make our free will judgments, and therefore we can be punished and rewarded appropriately. Examiners do love questions on this idea of God rewarding and punish justly, or a just God. They do love that question. And again, you can bring Anselm in. If you see any question on reward and punishment, or anything to do with just, it's to do with free will. Have you got free will? If you've got free will, you can therefore be rewarded and punished justly. If you don't have free will, how can you be rewarded? Walter Stove also pops in here and says that God is freed from the bondage of temporality. So God is freed from the bondage, think of it like handcuffs that's being tied down. God is not tied down by temporality. Temporality is just a really nice way of saying time. God is not tied down by time. Fabulous quote. Really love that quote. Don't forget, Walter Stove is not supporting the oldies, he's just giving us really good one-liners. Walter Stove supports Swinburne. You're doing really well, everyone. As far as the next slide is concerned then, we then move into the philosophical problems. So you've got 2 boxes, 2 on the board. I'm just put them up there because you can see that actually they're nicely spaced out, and obviously the other bit, the defence, is going to go in between. Apologies, I'll move that back up. So just leave yourself a little bit of space and I'll talk us through them. So the other question examiners love asking for nature of God are anything to do with philosophical problems. Critically, it says the philosophical problems of God's eternal nature. These are the philosophical problems of the idea of eternal as timeless. Why is it a philosophical problem? Because it's in philosophy. A philosophical problem is a problem that you can't find an answer to. It's a discussion. So the first problem is presented by Swinburne. Well, of course it is. That's why Swinburne does the opposing view. Swinburne argues that the notion of time being simultaneously present to God is incoherent, saying that he can't make much sense of this. So it's incoherent and Swinburne cannot make much sense of this. These are not all Swinburnes, only the bullet point that says Swinburne is Swinburne's, the rest are just general problems. The second problem is, how can God be personal and act in creation? So how can God have a conversation with Adam and Eve? How can God part the Red Sea? How can God speak to Moses through the burning bush if God remains outside of time at all time? And if God has no idea of what's in the past, present or future, how can God then interact with us? Third, if we're expected to love God, well, love's a two-way process. So how does God then love us? Final problem is, how can God then respond to our prayers? How can God respond to us if he has no idea when we are in time? However, you then have the defences. These are views that can defend against these problems. It's the layering of your evaluation. Paul Helm defends against Swinburne's point. Paul Helm says, God, considered as timeless, cannot have temporal relations with any of his creation. That's actually a really clever quote. What Paul Helm is saying there is that if God is considered timeless, outside of time, God then cannot have in time or temporal in time relations with his creation. If God's outside of time, he can't then be in time having relationships with us. What's so incoherent about that, Swinburne? What's so hard to get? Why can't you make much sense of that? So Paul Helm's saying, what's there not to get there? If he's outside of time, he can't then have in-time relations with us. Second of all, going this idea of God as being personal, maybe the language in the Bible that's used to talk about God being personal actually is just linking with the people at the time that are writing it. Maybe God never did actually act in the Bible and it was just a representation of the people and that reflection of their faith. And they talked about how they're inspired by God, but it's not actually God literally doing these things in time. Maurice Wiles then comes in at this point. Now, there used to be a whole topic on Maurice Wildes in Miracles in the Old Spec. Maurice Wildes was fabulous. I really liked Maurice Wildes. He was a religious believer, but he was a little bit unconventional. He argues that God did not do miracles. God does not grant miracles. Why? Because it would present a partisan God. A partisan God is a God that selects some to help and not others, which is what miracles suggest. Why has God helped those people, yet there's children starving in Africa? Why did God help certain people and then ignore them in the Holocaust? So miracles cause a lot of problems for God's nature. So that's why Maurice Wildes says, no, he just doesn't do any miracles. And so the point there is that Maurice Wildes argues that God loves all of us through creation equally. So it's this idea of, why should we love God if God can't love us? Maurice Wildes is arguing God does love us. He loves us through the gift of creation. Finally, Aquinas argues you shouldn't pray for a request, so God shouldn't have to respond, because you shouldn't be asking for anything in the first place. Excellent. Last box at the bottom of this slide will then finish off the idea of everlasting. We'll then have a quick brain break. So, the further issue, so this goes in the bottom box, the further issue is this. The God that Boethius ends up defining is a God that is intrinsically different from the God of classical theism. God of classical theism is your God of your omnis. Omnibenevolent, omnipotent, omniscient, etc. What Boethius is describing is a God that differs from this God. Why? Because it implies more of a deist God with a D. Because what about the incarnation, when God becomes man, when God becomes flesh through Christ? What happens about the virgin birth? What happens about the interaction and the point of prayer? All of these things are needed for the theist God with a TH, a theist God. Whereas if God didn't come to earth as Jesus, if God didn't have interactions, if God doesn't answer prayers, then what Boethius is describing is more of a deist God than a theist God. So it questions whether God is still the God of classical theism. As soon as you're ready, turn over your sheets. We're going to do 4 more slides and then we'll have a brain break. All right, so we then move into the second view of eternal. They will never say to you in an exam, everlasting eternal or timeless eternal. Why? Because these are the words that we've put to it. You could call it Boethian eternal and Swinburne's eternal. You don't have to call it timeless and everlasting. I do that because I want to differentiate it, which means in an introduction, you have to make it clear to an examiner that these are the terms that you're using. That Boethius is eternal timeless, that Swinburne is eternal everlasting. You have to make it clear to an examiner these are the terms that you're using. So, eternal as everlasting for Swinburne. That goes in the first box. The second box is going to be for Walter Storff. One solution to the problems raised by God's eternal nature is that God is actually everlasting. So he's not timeless, he's everlasting. Oh, apologies, wrong way. God always exists and will always exist. So God has no beginning and no end. God himself will not die, not born or die, so is infinite in that way. God exists without end, but time passes for God. God has an awareness of time. This supports a present and active God, answering prayers and granting miracles. So God himself still isn't affected by time. God himself still has no beginning and no end, but time actually passes for God. God is aware of time. And then Swinburne says this quote. Now, students don't really like this quote, but I think it's a very clever one. Swinburne says this: God knows the events of AD 1995 unless it means that he exists in 1995 and knows in 1995 what is happening. Hence, I prefer that understanding of God being eternal as his being everlasting rather than his being timeless. Now, the bit that's underlined is the bit that I think you should write down, the second half of the quote. I also would put e.g. 1995. Why 1995? Because obviously that's when he's writing it and that's when he's presenting this view. So years before you were even born, which is very depressing. But this idea of 1995 is just when he's presenting it. So what he is saying is, God can only know the events of that time if God is in that time and existing in that time. He cannot know it if he's not there. And so then he moves on to say that he prefers the understanding of God as eternal. Eternal is the attribute we're discussing here. Eternal as everlasting, rather than being timeless. So once again, there are two views on eternal. One is everlasting, one is timeless. All he is saying is he likes the view of everlasting rather than the view of timeless. Why? Because if God is timeless, he cannot therefore know the events that are happening. He has to be everlasting to know what is happening at a certain time. That is a brilliant quote to start an essay with. In an introduction on eternal, because you can use that quote to then explain the two different views, and you would say how Swinburne is supporting an everlasting view and how Boethius is supporting a timeless view, or Anselm if you want to really go funky, have fun. Okay, so either way, timeless is Boethius, everlasting is Swinburne. Those are also your evaluation. You use them against each other. You have to get off the fence. You can't be both. You can't be Team Boethius and Team Swinburne. You're either one or the other. Either God is outside of time or God is in time. This is when Walterstorff then comes in. Walterstorff to the box to the side. Oh, apologies, there's a little bit on the bottom of that slide. I didn't realise, sorry. The little bit at the bottom says, therefore, an everlasting God fits more satisfactory with God as revealed in the Bible. So he's saying that an everlasting God, a God that interacts with time, fits more closely with the Bible. Box to the side, we then have Walterstorff. Walterstorff says that the only way to understand some of God's actions in the Bible is to see them as responses. This is a very, very clever point. What he's saying is that we still have free choices, but then God responds to the free choices we make. And so the 10 plagues is a perfect example of this. Moses goes to see the Pharaoh. He asks the Pharaoh to make a free will choice of letting his people go, and he says no through free will. God then responds with a plague. God doesn't give a plague before the Pharaoh has a chance to make his decision. So God responds to the actions that we make, showing that God is aware of time. God is aware of time passing. God knows what is happening at specific times, so he can then respond. Walterstorff also argues that you cannot criticise an everlasting God for not knowing the events of the future. God cannot know the future because the future has not yet happened, so God only knows the past and the present. Because God's omniscience only includes knowing what has happened. Don't forget, omniscience we're going to bring back in later. So Swinburne and Walterstorff both argue that God cannot see the future because it has not yet happened. God's omniscience only knows what has happened and is happening. The future as it does not exist yet. So it doesn't need to know the future because the future does not yet exist. Therefore, it's illogical to assume that God knows it. So an everlasting God knows past and present, can interact, respond, but does not know the future. This is not a limitation of God according to Swinburne and Walterstorff. It's not a limitation because the future is not yet happened, is not yet known. Therefore, omniscience only includes everything that has happened and is happening, not what hasn't happened yet. If you get a question on eternal, this is what you use. This is eternal. I've sectioned it off so that you are clear with what it is that you need to bring in if you have an answer or a question. So they're often quite specific with these in the exam, or certainly they have in the past, because obviously this is the first time around for new spec, but this obviously is an old topic. So they might ask you eternal, they might ask you omnibenevolence, they might ask you omnipotence, they might ask you omniscience. One year they asked for 3 of those attributes, which was a hell of a big answer, but students did extremely well on it. This is the one to do if you want to get your A's and your A stars. Why? Because it's hard, it's difficult, you have to really know your arguments, you have to watch your language, you have to make sure you demonstrate your understanding as well as evaluate. You have to weigh up arguments, you have to use quotes, but this is the one that if you can do well, you will do very, very well in your exam in it. This one really is an opportunity to shine in the exam. Box underneath is for further philosophical problems. So again, 2 boxes, 2 points, then we have 1 more slide, then we'll have a little brain break. So eternal as timeless. This supports, so Boethius' view, this supports omniscience. God has all knowledge, past, present and future, all together. Fully omnipotent as well. God has power to create and remain separate from time. So God can have the power to create time and then stay separate. God is also perfect. He's not limited by time. He's not constrained by time. He's also immutable. He is not changed by time. But can he really love us if he isn't present in time? And can he really be personal if he doesn't interact in time? On the flip side, everlasting God supports omnibenevolence. He's active, personal. However, can God really be fully omniscient if he doesn't know the future? Is God immutable, unchanging? If God's coming in and out of time, if God's interacting with us, are we not then changing God? Is God not gaining new knowledge as time passes? Does that mean God changes? Is God perfect if is he limited by time? The final thin box is for the Deuteronomy quote that we looked at when we did it in lesson. So the Deuteronomy quote 33:27 is, "The eternal God is your refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms." Now, this is a good place to start an essay if you like this quote. The quote can be interpreted in many different ways. Refuge, first of all, I think of it like a home. Think of it like a refugee trying to find a home. So a refuge is somewhere that is a safe haven for people. And so you might interpret this quote as being both timeless and everlasting. You might see timeless as the refuge, that God is outside of time as your refuge over everyone. But also this idea of everlasting arms, the more in time. God is in time with his arms hugging you. And so God could be seen as both. 2, that God is just eternal as timeless. So the refuge and the arms are actually on the outside of time, that God is hugging all of time together, providing that refuge for everyone. Or you could see the refuge and the arms as both inside of time, that God is providing you a home and a refuge and the arms to hug you inside of time. And so the reason why this is a good quote to use in your introduction is you can introduce the different interpretations. So you can say how Boethius would interpret this as meaning timeless, outside of time, the refuge and arms are outside. You could use Swinburne to say how it shows everlasting, that the refuge and the arms are inside of time. Or you could even discuss the complexity of it by saying it could be one or the other or both, hence the problem with using texts. So it's completely up to you how you wish to use that, if you wish to use that. I know when we did it in lesson, some of you did not like that quote at all and you got completely bamboozled by it. So if you do not like it, don't do it. The boxes underneath, you have 3 sets of boxes, each split. The first 2 boxes, so we're going to go up and below, so we're going to do them like that rather than across. You're going to have 1 slide for Descartes, 1 slide underneath. The other slides are split, so you've got 2 slides going in these 2 next boxes. So we'll bring in now the next attribute of omnipotence. This is God's power. So let me put the slide up and then I'll point it out. So The 3 questions you don't need to write, but the 3 bullet points you do. So the 3 bullet points and the bit at the top goes in the first of your 6. So the first box at the top, so we'll just do that one. So the first box, omnipotence, concerns God's ability to do anything, even the logically impossible. And so when we did this in class, we looked at where we'd come across Descartes before. And obviously we'd come across Descartes most memorably within the ontological argument. We remembered that Descartes was actually a mathematician before he was a philosopher, and therefore he looked at the idea of a triangle being analytic just like God's existence is analytic. And so with these ideas, he is looking at logical, mathematical, analytical facts and placing both maths and God together. And so from there, he moves into his 3 points for omnipotence. The first is, God cannot be limited in any way. Therefore, as God is the source of logic, he's the reason we have logic, he's the creator of logic, God also has the power to suspend it, to stop it, to replace it, to suspend those laws. Saying that God conforms or follows laws of nature, logic and physics then restricts God. That implies that those laws are greater than God. If God cannot break them laws, if God can't break the laws of nature like gravity, that shows that they're more powerful than God. So in order for God to have full omnipotence, he has to be able to break those laws. And so not understanding how God can know everything is a limitation of our logic, not God. So by us not being able to understand how God can know everything is not therefore meaning God doesn't know everything. It actually just means we don't understand it as humans. And so for Descartes, God can do absolutely anything, even the logically impossible. Those 3 and the links to the questions, if you wish, go in that first box. There are 3 main arguments for omnipotence, hence the 3 sets. Descartes, Aquinas, Vardy. Now we go to the box underneath, not across. So the box underneath is a valuation of Descartes, hence why we keep our Descartes together. So the problems with Descartes is this. Mackie presents this weakness. The idea of logically impossible actions were, and this is a quote from him, only a form of words which fails to describe any state of affairs. Basically, you cannot have something that's logically impossible. That does not make sense. It doesn't mean anything. It's meaningless. And so it doesn't actually describe any state of affairs. If it's either logical or it's impossible. You cannot have something that's logically impossible. You either can have something that's logically possible or impossible. And so what J.L. Mackie is arguing there is logical impossibilities do not exist. It's an oxymoron. The words do not go together by definition. If it's logical, it can be done. If it's impossible, it can't be done. The words do not go together. Next weakness. This is not J.L. Mackie. So the next weakness is not J.L. Mackie. So these are the rest to go into that box. So you can split them up as you wish. So only the one that says Mackie is his. These are further 3 problems with that idea of God being able to do absolutely anything. It is not a lack of power or a lack of knowledge. It is just the fact that certain things are total nonsense. So God cannot make a circle into a square because that's just nonsense. It's not a lack of God's power. It's not a limitation of his knowledge. It's just the fact that that is nonsense. Also, it turns God into an arbitrary and unpredictable God. A God who can suddenly suspend nature and do whatever on earth what he wants. No, that makes God just unpredictable. And so it's very difficult to understand God and thus have a relationship with him if God can do just absolutely anything on a whim that he wants. Finally, if God can do absolutely anything, such as prevent evil and allow us to have free will, why doesn't he? Or give us free will so we only do good. If God can do anything, why doesn't he do things like that? He doesn't, and maybe because it is just nonsense. Maybe it's because it's not possible, or maybe because in this sense God cannot do absolutely anything. Brilliant. The next set of arguments then, you have Aquinas in the top part and Swinburne in the bottom part. So now this is one slide, two boxes. So Aquinas the top bit, Swinburne the bottom bit. Omnipotence concerns God's ability to do whatever is logically possible for a perfect God. So we're now logically possible, but only for a perfect God to do. And Aquinas says this: God has the power to do whatever it is logically possible for God to do. He says this quote, okay, again, Summa Theologica. Whatever involves a contradiction is not held by omnipotence, for it just cannot possibly make sense of being possible. Always clear. Actually, what he's saying is very, very clever. He just doesn't say it in words that are all that easy to understand. A contradiction is when you say something that doesn't go with something else. So it's when you say something and it doesn't work. And so, for example, God can sin. That's a contradiction of God's nature, because if God's perfect, God cannot sin. And so what he's arguing is this is not a lack of power. This is not held by omnipotence. It's not a lack of his omnipotence, because it's just not possible. It does not make sense. It is not possible to expect God to have contradictory attributes. So, for example, God cannot climb a tree because he doesn't have a body. If God had a body, the body would change and therefore it would be immutable and perfect. So it contradicts God's nature. It's not a lack of power. It's a contradiction of his perfection. Swinburne also supports this view. He agrees that God's omnipotence means God can do everything, but we must first of all understand what everything includes. Turning a square into a circle is not a thing. It's not something. It's not anything. Therefore, God does not have to be able to do it. God can do whatever is possible. God cannot do things that just don't even exist. You could, however, criticise that. And you could say, but maybe again it's our limited understanding that we can't see how a triangle can turn into a circle or whatever it might be. So maybe it just shows our limitation, not God's limitation. So you can come back with that idea of it's not a thing, but maybe it's not a thing to us, but might be something to God.
Is it unacademic to use thing, just say it's not a thing?
No, that's fine, because he's using that
as long as
phrase.
you put it in there.
Yeah, fine.
Swinburne in the same one.
No, box underneath, please.
Oh, look. One side, two boxes.
Final slide for this section. You have the third part of omnipotence. This is called self-imposed limitation. Top box, Vardy. Bottom box, Macquarie. Two boxes, one slide. Peter Vardy talks about how God's omnipotence is limited. God is not in control of the whole of history or able to move pieces like on a chessboard. So he can't move backwards and forwards. He can't go into the past, go into the present, look into the future. He can't move things around in history and change time and move back time. God created the universe in such a way that his ability to act is actually limited. The universe is created to suit free, rational creatures, that's us. Therefore, God limits his power over this. This is self-imposed limitation. God is still all-powerful because only God can limit his own power. Put in simple terms, God made everything. He then limits his power over his control over everything. But he's still all powerful because he has the power to do that. He has the power to limit his own power. So he's self, meaning God, imposes it upon himself. So God is doing it upon himself, and he therefore has all the power to be able to do that, but it also means that everything now is out of his control. John Macquarie on the other side, so box underneath. Similarly, Macquarie argues that God is not constrained by logic, laws of nature and physics, nor the acts of free acting humans. God merely chooses to limit his power out of love for humanity. So God chooses to not intervene, not stop, not affect laws of nature, not affect our free choices because of love for us. When speaking of God's power, we do so as an analogy. God's power is very different from our own. So we are comparing similar things, our power to God's. But these can never be the same because God is infinitely greater than us. You can make a link there if you want to analogy of proportion. That's what he's talking about there. Our power is in proportion to each other. God's power is in proportion to God, but they are not in proportion with each other. So we are comparing similar things, but God is infinitely greater. If you get a question in the exam on omnipotence, it would just be these 3 slides we've just done, or the 4 slides with Dake has weaknesses. So this is what you would focus on. It certainly would be the narrowest section you could get, unless you get asked a question on Ansem, and I think that would just be too cruel, and it's 4 dimensions. So you would just stick with comparing these 3 views. You'd analyse and evaluate each of the 3 views and which one works the best. God can do everything. God can do what is logically possible for a perfect God, and God controls his own power. So you would just weigh up which argument works the best. It certainly would be a shame if you got that one in the exam, because you can't show off as much as getting a Boethius, an eternal, or an omniscience, or an omnibenevolence one. Alright, we then move into the final box at the bottom of this page, is where we now bring in omniscience. Omniscience is for the remainder of this coverall. So omniscience, there are 3 views: divine, timeless and everlasting. So the box at the bottom is only a small one, but this is for Calvin, so that's to go into that bottom box. Now the reason it's so small and squished is because you don't have to know Calvin here. The only reason we're doing Calvin is because this is what Boethius is trying to avoid, a predeterministic idea of God. We also do Calvin in a lot of other places, like Death and Afterlife. He's the one that says about election. So it's all the same argument. Whenever you see Calvin is arguing the same thing. Does God know the future as part of his omniscience? That is the question. Does God know the future? If the answer is yes, then that is known as divine foreknowledge. Divine meaning God, foreknowledge, knowledge before it happens, or knowledge of the future. God foreknows all of my acts. What God foresees must happen, and therefore you cannot be free. This is the argument presented by John Calvin. He uses the biblical quote in Ephesians, "In love he predestined us," meaning predestined before the beginning of time, beginning of creation. God decided the fate of absolutely everyone throughout all time. And so by predestined we mean who is going to be elected for heaven, who is going to be elected for hell. No matter what you do, you are either going to go to heaven or to hell. And so your acts are not free, your choices are not free, you are determined on that path no matter what you do. So for he does not create everyone in the same condition, but ordains eternal life for some and eternal damnation for others. That's from Calvin. So basically, God has already chosen or pre-elected who will be eternally saved and who will be eternally damned. You will see the relevance of this as we bring in Boethius. As soon as you are happy, you can turn over your sheets onto the final side. As I said, Calvin is purely an extra. You will not get a question specifically on Calvin. This is just to show what Boethius is trying to avoid. Do not forget, Calvin lived about 1,000 years after Boethius. Boethius is criticising the idea, not Calvin himself. On the final side of the sheet, you have 4 columns at the top. There is 1 slide to go in each of these, and they are the 4 arguments presented by Boethius. This is when it starts to get heavy again. Once we've done the 4, the rest of the sheet is fairly straightforward. Let's bring in Boethius then. Team Boethius, we love you. The problem for Boethius, so this goes in the first of your 4 columns, please. The problem for Boethius was, how can God have divine foreknowledge of the future, full omniscience, and we still remain free agents? So this was his problem. How can God have full omniscience? God had to have full omniscience in order to be the God of classical theism. He has to know everything. But if God knows everything, how are we then free? This was the problem that Boethius focused on. And he did this in the consolation of philosophy. So when in his prison cell, he was comforted by Lady Philosophy. That was an imaginary person. And so this all comes about in chapter 5 and chapter 6, or book 5 and book 6 of the consolation. She's consoling him. Don't forget, he's about to be executed, and so rather than wallowing in his own misery, he talks about this hopeless conflict. The hopeless conflict that is between divine foreknowledge and freedom of human will. I do recommend you learn 1 or 2 other quotes from this topic. It's a recommendation, it's not a necessity. Why? Because it will help you to articulate yourself properly in your exams. So he argues in the Consolation of Philosophy, chapter 5, that there is a hopeless conflict between divine foreknowledge of all things and freedom of human will. Hopeless conflict because they don't go together. How can God have full omniscience? How can we have free will? Both of these he's going to argue and justify are very, very important, and that's what's coming up in the next part of the slides. He justifies why God needs to know everything and why we need free will. So, he works through these problems. You need to write all of this down because this is how you'll structure your exam answer. If God knows the future of our actions, how can our actions therefore be free? Boethius asks questions like this. And if God sees everything in advance, my acts, plans, wishes, thoughts, choices, Boethius goes into all of it. This isn't just does what God knows you're going to do. This is your thought process. This is your plans. This is your intentions. God knows absolutely everything. And God cannot be fooled or deceived. Then whatever God's providence foresees will happen. Providence is knowledge of the future. What that means is God knows everything in advance. Your choices, your wishes, your wills, your plans, everything. And you cannot fool or deceive God. So it's not every morning I have shredders for breakfast. God knows I have shredders, but, fooled you God, I'm going to have toast this morning. No, God knew I was going to have toast this morning. I didn't have toast, I didn't have any bread in. But God knew that. You cannot fool God or deceive God. God knows absolutely everything. The future cannot change. Otherwise, what God sees is just fallible opinion. If it's, it might have been toast, it might be shredders, it might be scrambled eggs. If God just thinks, it could be one of these, then it's just fallible opinion. Fallible meaning imperfect. God has to know the exact choice you're going to make. Otherwise, God is just a gambler. Or no more than what you might do if you went in my kitchen and saw the different things I had. God has to know exactly what it is you're going to make. So, God has full knowledge of everything, but then we're not free. Absolutely not. This is why Boethius was not happy. So please let me be very, very clear. When you are writing this in your exam, you have to make it so clear that Boethius is trying to avoid the problem of if God knows everything, how we are therefore not free. That's what he's trying to avoid. So many students in the exam say, as a weakness against Boethius, therefore we don't have free will. No, that's the whole point of the argument. That's what he's trying to avoid. He's trying to say how both can exist. And so the second column is, why do we need free will then at all? If God knows everything, why do we actually need to be free? And so this is where Boethius continues. He says it's pointless to argue a predeterministic God, a God that determines our actions, like Calvin 1,000 years later, whereby God has knowledge of all of our actions because, and this is where reward and punishment come in, it is pointless to reward and punish. If my actions are not free and voluntary, and therefore not governed by my own will, it is therefore unjust to reward and punish me. And so what Boethius is arguing is, we have to have free will, so that we are rewarded and punished justly. How can you not have free will? You are determined to do bad things and then God punishes you. How is that fair? So no, Boethius is arguing very, very clearly that we have to have free will so that reward and punishment in afterlife is just. This means we have to be the authors of our own actions. And this is all Boethius' language, by the way. He says it's the authors of actions. We have to be the authors, the people in charge and control of what we do. We have to be responsible for our vices and virtues. Again, that is Boethius. We have to be in control of the good and bad things we do, so we are rewarded and punished. Please be aware, obviously this is an old spec topic, the only bit that's been really added in is the Anselm bit. Examiners love questions on either the idea of reward and punishment or philosophical problems with an idea. So if you get a question on reward and punishment, this idea of a just or unjust God, this is what you talk about. How God is just because we still have free will. So God must have full knowledge, as he explains on the previous slide, but I must have free will. Hence the hopeless conflict, hence the pages and pages of him going round and round and round in circles on this. And I actually, if you remember, I inflicted that text on you. It's a awful text to read. It's horrendously difficult. So many pages later, he finds the answer to this fundamental problem. God is eternal. I think I nearly cried when I read that as the answer. God's eternity explains how God can be both omniscient and how we have free will. So basically, the first side of the PowerPoint, the first side of the coverall is the answer. Fortunately for you, I'm going to make the links clearer. But what I need to explain now is this. When Boethius wrote his book, he didn't write about the eternal, timeless nature of God and omniscience separately. They go together. He starts by talking about the hopeless conflict. The solution is eternal. Why have I separated them? Because if you get a question on eternal in the exam, you do the first side of the coverall. If you get a question on omniscience, you do this side of the coverall. You have to keep the attributes separate because of the questions you might get in your exam. Boethius does not separate them. Boethius talks about them together. Whereas if we'd have done them together, you would not know then what to do in your exam. So you have to remember eternal means where is God in position to the world, the universe. Omniscience is what does God know and see. So, third box to try and make this clearer. How then? How is this possible? How is God's eternal nature as timeless? The answer. God does not see past, present and future. But all of time together is at the same time. It's an eternal present, like a cluster. Now, the cluster example is mine, which means you have to explain to an examiner what you mean. If you just put e.g. cluster, an examiner will have no clue. What do you mean? What it means is this. Past, present and future are clustered together. They are together. Do you remember when we actually physically demonstrated this and I stood on a chair and looked down and past, present, future and you were all stood together in like a rugby scrum all together, okay? That is how God sees time. Past, present and future are in there, but he doesn't distinguish it as, oh, that's the past and that's the present. All time is just there. God sees all of time, but does not distinguish what is in the past, present or future. God does not know events as, oh, that's the past, or oh, that's the future. He just knows the events themselves. What this means is everything is present eternally. It is not past, present and future. That's linear. That's a timeline. That's how we experience time. It's not past, present, future. It's just present. All in one go. The cluster, all of time, all of knowledge. And so this means that God has all knowledge still, full omniscience, but it's knowledge of all events, not past, present and future, because that's the human construct, human concept. So Boethius concludes that this is not knowledge of future events, but knowledge of a never-changing present. Louisa.
I don't get how you can say that he would see. I don't get why he has to particularly say that you can see past, present, future. Because if you're outside time, you wouldn't have past, present, future because that depends on where you are in time. So if you're outside time, why do they need to? Why does it say that it's not? He doesn't see it past, present, future. Like, why is that a point that you need to specifically learn?
I think it's because I agree. I think you've got a very good point there. The idea that if he's outside of time, he doesn't have
So he won't be like
in time. He doesn't have in time understanding of it. I think it's because Boethius had, for his God had to know everything, and so then if God does know the future, then people say, well, how are we free then? How do we have free will? So it's just this idea of if God does know the future, how is it possible to have free will? And it's just then the idea of God just sees everything together rather than it being past, present and future. So you're pretty much supporting Boethius' argument. Yeah. Sam?
I don't understand how this allows for free will.
Go on.
You tell me, how does it allow for free will? Just because he doesn't see it as the future doesn't mean that it eradicates like the problems of free will with divine foreknowledge.
What I think you're working there on is a weakness. So the weakness of this is, just because he doesn't say that's the future, he still knows it, therefore it's still not free. Yeah, that's a weakness.
Okay.
So what you would...
I've just found understanding it.
No. So what you would do is, you would explain and justify what Boethius is arguing. You would then, afterwards, once you've made it really clear to the examiner what he's trying to do, you would then say, however, it's not very successful, because even if he just sees the events and they're not in the future, it's still the events, therefore how are we still free? Yeah, spot on weakness. No, it's not that you don't understand it, it's that is a problem with his argument. Yeah, very good, Sam. Okay. Final column then, the fourth one. What does this all mean? And the summary of Boethius. God does not have divine foreknowledge in the Calvinistic sense. God does not know the future. God does not know past, present and future, because this is the way we see time. We see time temporally linear as a line. We can't go into the past, we can't speed up into the future, we have to go along it in a line. Whereas God just sees everything, including all history, in a single glance. One glance, there's time, it's there. Full knowledge of all time. This means that God is justified in reward and punishing us, as we are totally free to decide our actions. In other words, God has eternal omniscience, so timeless omniscience, but not divine foreknowledge, because this means God would determine our actions. So God remains outside of time, sees all of time in one glance. This doesn't mean that God sees the future as this is the future, as the future stands in past, present and future. God just sees all actions that happen in time in one go. God knows everything, but as a collective whole, not past, present and future. Now this is really tricky stuff. However, this is the one that you'll get your A's and your A stars in. If you can do this properly, if you can focus on the way that I have worded this and follow the structure, follow the structure, you can do very, very well. But this is a tricky one. I hope in some ways it is on your exam in summer, because you will really have the opportunity to shine if you can do this. However, this topic is like Marmite, you either love it or you hate it. However, if you hate this one, for goodness sake, learn your religious languages, because don't forget you have to do 3 out of 4 questions. So if you get a question on nature of God and a question on religious language, there's 2 religious language topics. Chances of one of them not coming up is very small. If you then don't do religious language, all this, you're scuppered. So you have to make sure if this one is your Marmite topic, you learn your religious language. Alright, so that is Boethius done. The rest of the PowerPoint is fairly straightforward. So, next box is just for Aquinas' bird's eye view, the God sat on the hill analogy. So nice and simple, nice small box. Aquinas says this. Are we alright? Are we alright? Are we alright, Sam?
I've just missed the box out somehow.
Okay. God has a bird's eye view on the whole of history that is the theocentric from God's perspective. So, linking with his quote here, God sees all things together and not successively. Successively means one after another. So God sees things all together, one glance, one go as a whole, not one thing after another. This means God sees everything but not linear. Linear, again, is the human perspective on time. God takes in all of history as a whole. Always thinks, this is, as I said, this is complicated. The way that I learn and understand this is by referring the words into an easier way in my head. So whenever I see the word whole, I think of it as a circle, as a whole. Whenever I see the word linear, I think of a line. So it's basically a circle versus a line. The line is the linear time, past, present, future. The whole is this idea of all of it in one go. Sam?
What was the walkers at the hill?
So, the walkers on the hill is this idea that God sits on top of a hill. He sees the past path, the present path, and the future path of the walkers over or on the hill. He doesn't intervene, he doesn't affect them on the path. They can make free decisions whilst on the path, but he can still see where they've come from and where they're going. So he still sees the past, he still sees the future, but they have free will whilst on that path. Yeah?
That's what I thought. How is it? That's the opposite of what Aquinas is saying.
But
Aquinas is saying you can't see it linearly, and then the walkers at the hill is like a linear.
yeah, like it. It's good criticism.
Is the example?
So, yeah, that's an example, yeah. He uses the walkers. Well, he might not call it the walkers on the hill, but this idea of a bird's eye view, the theocentric perspective, is the Aquinas idea. And so he's still seeing it as a whole, though. He's still seeing the whole of time. He's still seeing it all in one go. But I do see what you mean by he's seeing it in some sort of successive order still as well.
I couldn't give an example
of that.
Experience in time.
Yeah, so that's his analogy again. He's using an analogy to try and help understand. Fine, criticise it. That's good. This is a good analogy to use in the middle of an essay. Why? Because it's a bit of both. It's a bit of God in time, because God's kind of on a hill in time and sees the walkers on the path in time, but it also implies God's outside of time because there's no interaction between them. So this is a bit Boethian and a bit Swinburne, so it's nice to put into the middle of an essay if you want to.
Amy?
Yeah.
For a quote like that, would you say that's a good introduction quote, or that needs more analysis in the middle of an essay?
You could use it both. So if you use a quote like that in an introduction and you want to bring it back in later, fine. You can, no. Often, it's a very good question, Libby. Often I say to avoid using the same quote twice in an introduction and then later on in an essay, but that's normally because it just shows students haven't learned more than one quote. Whereas, so if you keep using like Aristotle's, nothing comes from nothing in your introduction and then nothing comes from nothing later, an examiner will just think, oh, well, they've clearly not learned any other quotes, so they're just blagging it. Whereas if you use something like that which needs a bit more time in an intro and then bring it back into your argument later, fine. final section then of this coverall is going to be for everlasting omniscience. So the slide as it looks like that. You're now going to go across again. So you've got option 1, one box, then option 2, then option 3, and the arrows coming from them are going to be the examples for each of these. So option 1 goes into the first box that's a little bit larger, the little box in the middle is for option 2, and the box at the end is for option 3. So these are the 3 views for everlasting omniscience. Don't forget, everlasting means comes in and out of time but does not know the future. And so these are the 3 views of everlasting omniscience. So the first one is this. God's omniscience is limited to what is logically possible. The future hasn't yet happened, therefore it's unknown. And so this is not a lack of power. This is not a limited omniscience because it's impossible to know it. It's impossible to know what has not yet happened. And so God still has perfect knowledge of what has occurred and is occurring. This means God's knowledge changes over time. God can acquire new knowledge as time passes. So the first option, or the first understanding, is this idea that God doesn't know the future because the future has not yet happened. This is not a limitation of omniscience. It just is illogical to know it. The second option is God deliberately chooses not to know the future so that we have free will. Third option, God just knows all possible choices. So God just knows all possibilities. Now, in your exam, please do not call them option 1, option 2 and option 3. An examiner will have absolutely no clue what you're talking about. I've called them that to help you see that there's 3 different views on everlasting. If you just want to argue the first one as the everlasting one, because that's going to be the Swinburne one as you find out in a second. If you just want to argue option 1 and forget option 2 and 3, that's fine. But what I found over the years is students then say, oh, what happens if God just doesn't know the future because he limits it? Oh, what happens if God just knows all possible outcomes? So the reason I've done it as 3 options is because this avoids then you asking those sorts of questions. But do not call them that in your exam. So just say that there's 3 different ways of understanding everlasting omniscience, the first being, and then evaluate and discuss it. But you don't have to do all 3. You can just do the first one if you wish. You'll see why the first one, because the first one's a bit more to go with it, whereas the other 2 are just extras.
Which one is Boethius?
So no, Boethius is not everlasting omniscience, so he's totally different. We've only got 4 slides left. You're doing ever so well. So, box underneath, option 1, option 1. So the option 1 goes to the box underneath, option 2 goes to the box underneath. So, the supporter of the first view is Swinburne. He supports this in the coherence of theism. God does not know what will happen in the future because an omniscient being knows every true proposition. True propositions, statements of logic, 2 + 2 = 4. The future isn't true or false because it hasn't happened yet. Therefore, God does not need to know it. This goes with this idea of power as well. It's not logically possible to know the future because the future hasn't yet happened. So it links in with his argument of omnipotence as well. So that goes in the first box underneath with your first arrow, so you should have them linked together now. Option 2 goes into the middle box. God limits what he knows to preserve our free will. This is similar to self-imposed limitation explored by Vardy and Macquarie. So this is the idea that God limits what he knows so we have free choice. So he has self-limited or self-imposed limited omniscience. He could know the future, but he doesn't, so we have free will. first one. You might want to know option 3 though, because we do have Schleiermacher as well, so you don't have to learn them all, but certainly it's good to have.
There's quite a lot, isn't there?
Yeah. So it's just to show the 3 variations of views on everlasting, but yeah, there is quite a lot.
So are these ones, because the top one says Swinburne, are these are the ones from people? That option 2 is not a name.
No, so these are just perspectives, and Swinburne goes with that perspective. So like Vardy and Macquarie could go with the second perspective. So it's more the boxes above are the views on everlasting, and then you have people that support those views. Yeah. Final box for this section is option 3. There's quite a bit to go in this slide, in this box, so you might want to just summarise as best as you can, but this is where we bring back in Schleiermacher. Apologies for pronunciation there. Please check your spelling.
Would you get penalised if you spelled it wrong?
No, but an examiner would certainly be impressed and would notice. I notice when students spell it right. So it is doable. It's just EIE, so just try and do whatever you can to spell it right. It is doable, and it certainly will again help you with your A's and your A stars. He argued that there is a possible solution to the problem of whether God's omniscience restricts our freedom. He drew the analogy of the knowledge that close friends have of each other's future behaviours, omniscient but still free will. This is a little bit like what we were discussing earlier. This is the idea of predictions. So this is the option 3, this is more everlasting though. For example, when I go out with my friend...
Were you drinking when you got this PowerPoint as well?
No, why? No.
Just this bit that you're going to read out to.
Yeah. When I go out with my friend, because she doesn't like to drink after eating, we always have to go for a bottle of wine before our meal rather than after. And so because of that, I can predict that as soon as I get into the taxi, I say to her, shall we go for tea first? I'm more of an eater first rather than a drinker first. I would say to her, shall we go for tea first? And she always goes, without fail, no, let's just go for a quick drink first. Quick drink doesn't often happen. And so I know, and I can predict her behaviour. That doesn't mean I have full omniscience. I just know her behaviour. I can predict her behaviour. It's a bit like if I ever go to El Gringos. If I go to El Gringos, I always, and again it's the same example I gave you before, I always look at the menu. My friends know full well I'm going to order a chicken burrito medium, but I still look at the menu. I still like it. Very predictable. And so this is the idea that we still have free will, even though your future behaviours are very predictable. And so this is the view that God just knows us so well, he can predict our future behaviours. This is not the Boethian idea though, because Boethius would argue that's still fallible opinion, because it's still a prediction. Therefore, Schleiermacher is saying that this is comparable with God's knowledge of our actions. His knowledge does not force or affect what we choose to do. My friend might choose to have food first. I might choose to have steak. Okay? It doesn't affect or force, but, and we can still be held morally responsible, but we're still fairly predictable. But this is different from what Boethius is arguing. Boethius would argue that this is fallible opinion still. Whenever you predict, there's always a chance of being wrong. God cannot be wrong. Therefore, God has to know the actions.
Is it possible that we could then surprise God with our choices?
Exactly. So then if you surprise him, he's no longer... So then if you surprise God, he's no longer perfect because he's changed, because he's surprised. And therefore, again, not that God of classical theism. Yeah, exactly.
So, does God know all the possible things we could choose?
Yes, according to option 3, yes. So God knows all possible choices, but can predict, because he knows you so well, which one you're most likely to go for.
He is aware of all the options, just
yes.
know 100% what you will do.
Yes, but Schleiermacher's arguing that because God knows each of us so well, he's pretty much certain what it is you're going to do, but there's still that small level of unpredictability. Yeah. You probably run out of space completely. I imagine you will have done now. But you have two names to back that up as well. And again, the bracket's 3 because it's option 3 they support. Don't worry if you have run out of space. If you want to post it, I'm happy to come around with post-it notes as well. But basically, Louis of Molina says God's omniscience includes all possibilities for the future. And Augustine says God simply knows our choices. So God knows the choices we're going to make. Does anybody want to post it note just to put with option 3 as well? Yeah.
Augustine's just worded everything really clearly. That's what we're on about.
Yeah, yeah. The answer you could potentially do in the exam for this will be brilliant. Even if you just touch upon this idea of the consolation of philosophy, with lady philosophy, this idea of using words like providence, using quotes, using the different names, and really getting a grip of what Boethius is trying to do with the hopeless conflict, even if it's not successful, and then the opposing views, you can do very, very well. You can also belly flop astronomically. So if you do want to have a go at this and you're not sure, practice one. Do a practice one.
How would you fall into the trap of getting wrong?
Because students make out that Boethius is God, doesn't allow for free will, and they don't make it clear that Boethius is trying to avoid that at all costs because we have to be rewarded and punished. Because you can criticise him, but you have to make it clear he's trying to avoid it at all costs, even if he's not successful in it.
Yeah, so he's trying even if it doesn't fully encapsulate it.
Yeah. Final slide, final 3 boxes. So these 3 are these 3. And so I'm just going to put it up there and you can just work through at your own time and speed. These are the final philosophical problems with omniscience. Divine foreknowledge, Calvin, Boethius' omniscience, and limited omniscience. Now, once again, in your introduction, if you want to call it Boethius' omniscience, that's fine. Or if you want to call it timeless omniscience, that's fine. Make it clear to an examiner who goes on which side though. Make it clear to an examiner that you know there's different interpretations of omniscience, like there's different interpretations of eternal, and where they fall. I call it timeless omniscience and I call it everlasting omniscience because that's how I present it to you. An examiner won't necessarily understand your phrasing, so you have to make it clear in your introduction who supports what. So, the problem with divine foreknowledge, how can we be held responsible if God knows all of my actions? Also, how can we be judged evil and punished? Does this not make God responsible? If God sees the path we're on, knows exactly what we're going to do, is God therefore not responsible in some way then of putting us on that path in the first place? And this is where the classical problem of evil comes in. If God can see it, why doesn't he stop it? Either he doesn't love us or he's not powerful enough. And he's both powerful and loving, then why does God then punish us for things we have no control over? Boethius' omniscience. Can God really know everything if God doesn't know what it's like to change? However, he does try to support free will of humans and allows God to reward and punish justly. However, if God just sees events not on a time scale, are we still totally free? So just because he just sees the events, even though he doesn't know when they're going to happen, are them still really genuinely free choices? Finally, for limited omniscience, can God know new events as they happen if God doesn't change? And if God does change, can God still be perfect? If God cannot see the future, even if it's logically impossible, does this not remove his omnipotence? So see again how many questions are on there. Don't lump loads of rhetorical questions. Don't forget your evaluation has to be more than just rhetorical questions. So use only 1 or 2 of them. But they are questions you can't answer. They're posing evaluation and then you would discuss them. Don't forget to link everything back to the question. And with this one, certainly if you go back through it or you listen back to it, it is not that you don't necessarily understand it, it's because what you're presenting is weaknesses against it. But you have to pick a team. You're either Boethius or you're Swinburne. You're either everlasting or you're timeless. Once you've made your decision, it then becomes so much easier to see how this all fits together, because you're either going for it or against it.
That last box is Swinburne, isn't it?
Yes, correct. Yeah. I personally am Team Boethius all the way. Why? Because this idea of a God that can come in and out of time, even if God responds to our actions, the Holocaust went on 10 years. So even if God didn't know the Holocaust was going to happen, he certainly didn't seem to be responding through the process of it happening. So for me, that becomes a God that doesn't love us. That for me becomes a partisan, random God that seems to act sometimes and not other times. Whereas this idea of a God that just remains outside of time, that remains fair, that remains this God of classical theism, and that can love us through creation, for me that makes far more sense. That God then does have the ability of knowing events, has full knowledge, whereas a God that doesn't know the future, well, isn't that just as good as humans then? But that's the way that I would argue it. You have to decide. Just because that's the way I see it doesn't mean that's right. It's just the way that I would argue it. Most students over the years have supported Swinburne more. Most students over the years have been more everlasting. It purely depends what attributes you think God should have. If you think God should have all loving and personal, then you're more everlasting. If you think God should have power and omniscience and immutability, you're more Boethius. Finally, and I'll come to you, Lucy. Finally, if you get a question on omnibenevolence, there's no slide on here for omnibenevolence. Why? Because it's the whole lot. If you do eternal, if God's outside of time, how can he love us? If God's in time, just as I've said, how can he love and not respond? So it would be any part of this that you can then link to this idea of love. You could do omnipotence. If God can do anything, why can't he love us and stop evil? And so omnibenevolence links to all of it. Louisa? Right, thank you very much everybody, very, very well done.